Hello, I'm retired Captain Barney Rubel, U.S. Navy. I've been asked to talk to you today about a certain perspective I've developed on how different arrangements of a world map can produce geopolitical insights. This conference is about the future of the oceans, and I believe that not only can the way a Mercator map of the world indicate certain geopolitical dynamics, it can be suggestive. That is, it can reveal certain useful and perhaps necessary policy vectors for the future. First, a little of my bona fides for talking about things like this. Beyond my 2 decades as a carrier aviator, I spent over 20 years as a faculty member at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. While there, I taught planning and decision making and a number of other subjects related to naval operations and strategy. I directed the wargaming department for several years and then took over as dean of the college's research arm, the Center for Naval Warfare Studies. In that capacity, I designed and led a research effort that supported the development of the 2007 Sea Service Strategy document, A Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power. My experiences at sea around the world, as well as with wargaming and strategy development, gave me a deep appreciation for the world's maritime geography. Moreover, those experiences gave me a similarly deep appreciation for maps and charts. I guess this combination of experience, research, and gaming prepared my mind for an epiphany I had back in 2013, how alternate depictions of geography can yield new geopolitical insights. Geopolitics is the study of how geography influences human politics. For a sailor like me, the influence that the configuration of the world's oceans has on geopolitical affairs is of primary interest. But the oceans are large, and so to understand them, we resort to charts and maps, specifically and most commonly Mercator projections of the world. In 2013, the Naval War College was tasked to support an all-flag officer conference the Chief of Naval Operations wanted to hold to achieve better global coordination among fleet commanders and other naval leaders. In preparation, we ordered the printing of a massive 20 by 40 foot canvas map of the world. More on that later, but while looking at the map I laid out on the floor of the auditorium, I realized that the way a map is depicted could offer useful insights on potential future directions of U.S. policy. Let me start by saying that physical geography is not the only basis for drawing a map of the world. It can also be depicted in schematic terms, be they economic, political, or some other factor. In this presentation, I will use several schematic maps in addition to the normal Mercator projection. Next slide, please. So we'll start with a schematic depiction of the world. Alfred Mackinder, a British geographer who is widely regarded as the father of geopolitical study, devised the theory of the Heartland. His famous book, Democratic Ideals and Reality, was published in 1919 and laid out the geopolitical theory that Eurasia was a potential powerhouse due to its resources and population. The gist of it was that if some power could unify or organize in his vernacular, the bulk of the Eurasian continent, it would dominate the world. This illustration was directly lifted from his groundbreaking book on the subject. The fear of some power unifying Eurasia has driven British and later American policy for the last 2 centuries. His famous syllogism was, "Who rules East Europe commands the Heartland. Who rules the Heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world." This has been a geopolitical nightmare in one form or another for British and later American statesmen since at least the days of Napoleon. Next slide, please. Interestingly, Mackinder offered what might be called a reciprocal of his Heartland theory. A unified ocean confers dominant influence. This concept anteceded his Heartland theory, but there's a logic that connects the two seemingly contradictory statements. A unified Eurasia would have the industrial power to build a dominant navy. But it appears that thus far in history, his observation on sea power has carried the day. Next slide, please. Mackinder's work spawned much subsequent theorizing about geopolitics. Nicholas Speakman of Yale introduced the idea of the Rimlands, the control or at least prevention of control of which would prevent a heartland power from achieving global dominance. This idea has figured prominently in U.S. policy, especially since the end of World War II. Speakman reformulated Mackinder's syllogism as follows. Who controls the Rimland rules Eurasia. Who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world. Next slide, please. History has thus far played out in a manner very different from what either Mackinder or Speakman foresaw. The continent that was organized was North America, and it was the United States that became the principal power in the world. However, vice ruling or controlling the world, the United States established after World War II a framework of institutions, including the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and others, that were designed to prevent recurrence of the factors that led to the world wars, designed to establish a level economic playing field and provide forums for nations to air grievances and coordinate actions, as well as to seek justice. The international order that emerged can be termed a system. So despite many differing policies and many embedded hostilities, the system has endured, spawning extensive globalization, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. Now let's consider the world via the Mercator projection. Mackinder's and Speakman's theories were global in span, so it's natural that we consider them via a map of the world, and depicted here is a standard Mercator projection of the globe. We are not so much interested in the physical distortions inherent in the projection as we are the juxtaposition of the continents. While the relationship of the continents in the real world is subject only to plate tectonics, their relationships on a map can be depicted in several different ways, and that flexibility is what can lead to geopolitical insights. This is a common configuration of a Mercator chart, probably developed in England or Germany, that positions Europe in the center, with Asia off to the right and the New World off to the left. I actually have a large version of this hung on the wall of my office, which I purchased from the Swedish store IKEA. In a vague way, this projection follows the old T&O maps of the world from the Middle Ages, one of which is shown at the inset, which depicted Europe, Asia, and Africa, with Jerusalem in the center, which offers some insight into the mindset of Europeans at the time. I've labeled this map the Colonial World because it presents the world as European strategists from the 15th through the early 20th century would have seen the world. For them, this was a map of opportunities, places that could be exploited. Next slide, please. Likely you've seen this type of Mercator chart with the Western Hemisphere in the middle. Probably published in New York, its depiction of both oceans in their entirety suggests that the U.S. sees the world in bifurcated terms, Europe and the East. The oceans insulate us, but they're also highways to Eurasia, and we can take a region-by-region approach to security. This is the depiction the American sea power theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan likely had in mind as he crafted his ideas. At center, strategically, was the Monroe Doctrine, the defense of the Western Hemisphere. What this map depicted for Mahan was a world of threats that might emanate from Europe or possibly from Japan. When Mahan wrote his most influential works, the Panama Canal had yet to be finished, so the U.S. was bifurcated into two almost geographically independent coasts. Thus, there were two separate outside worlds for him to consider, Europe and the East. This outlook has been embedded in U.S. security doctrine since the American Revolution. Next slide, please. So as it turns out, the U.S. Unified Command Plan of regional areas of responsibility can be depicted easily on a Western Hemisphere-centric projection, which provides some insight into the mindset of U.S. policymakers, especially in the wake of the Cold War. The U.S. has had the luxury of looking at the world on a region-by-region basis. There was no global competitor or resource constraint that would force a shift in thinking to a true global perspective. Next slide, please. Chinese cartographers might produce this type of projection. The ocean of interest, the Pacific, is shown whole, while the Atlantic is bifurcated. This could indicate that the Atlantic is peripheral to Chinese interests. The Chinese strategists who conceived of the Belt and Road Initiative likely saw the world in this way. I have entitled it Mackinder's Nightmare precisely because it implies a whole Eurasia, where most of the world's population resides, and which can achieve potentially dominant influence. The U.S. and the rest of the Western Hemisphere is marginalized off to the right. Next slide, please. And then in 2013, I saw this. Our large map was printed in 4 sections of 90 degrees of longitude each, able to be Velcroed together in any order. For convenience, my faculty laid it out this way to facilitate placement of the over 600 models and markers needed to represent the entire U.S. Navy. Looking down at the map from the auditorium balcony, I realized the map was telling me something important. First, the U.S. was split down the Mississippi River. Beyond the physical convenience for placing markers, it implied that between New York and Los Angeles, there was nothing of geopolitical interest happening. But that was just a start. My initial insight was that the U.S. Navy does not deploy out from the U.S. Rather, it converges on Eurasia. This has major implications for Navy coordination and strategic planning, but also offers some additional geopolitical perspective. What if we sliced and diced the Mercator projection to reflect this large map? Next slide, please. Here, I've rearranged the Mercator projection to mimic what I saw on the game floor. What comes to mind is that, seen from the perspective of strategic planners in China and Russia, the U.S. is an edge power. If you are in Eurasia, no matter which way you look, you will eventually come to the U.S. Geopolitically, the U.S. encloses their world. Not a good thing from their perspective. Moreover, the oceans are not so much moats that protect us as they are highways for the U.S. to influence event in Eurasian rimlands. Again, not a good thing in Chinese or Russian eyes. Authoritarian continental Eurasian powers have two basic geopolitical rules. First, do not engage in two-front wars, and second, do not allow a strong neighbor to develop. The U.S. as an edge power prevents Eurasian continental powers from following either of those rules. Command of the Sea allows the U.S. to impose a multi-front war on anyone, and also turns the U.S. into a virtual, strong, pushy neighbor. This map indicates that the U.S. is in a perfect geographical position to act as kind of a sysadmin for the global system. Again, because there's nothing of geopolitical influence happening between the east and west coasts, the map can be split like this, and from a functional standpoint, the U.S. can exploit its command of the sea to defend the global system it established. Next slide, please. But that's not the whole story. Let's zoom in on Eurasia to get additional insight on the headaches that afflict strategists in Russia and China, and those of France and Germany before them. Life is tough enough for continental powers. First, they are geographic prisoners that lack unimpeded access to the world ocean. Whether the Skagerrak or the first island chain, there are geographic choke points that the U.S. can use to keep them penned up. Second, outside of these geographic obstacles, there is the global system. The previously mentioned network of alliances, international institutions, and rules the U.S. and the Allies established in 1944 to prevent the causes of another world war from occurring. The net effect is geopolitical enclosure, which is just fine from a U.S. standpoint, containment policy or no containment policy. This is one reason why Chinese and Russian strategists complain about U.S. hegemony. From his vantage point outside Eurasia, Nicholas Speakman could see the flow of geopolitics in terms of domination of the rimlands. For Russian and Chinese strategists, the problem is more immediate, breaking enclosure. The geographic constraints are bad enough, but they also have a geometry problem. Next slide, please. The resulting geopolitical geometry is not only a function of physical geography, but also fundamentally about the nature of political systems. If China was a democracy and willing member of the system, as opposed to a parasite using the system for its own purposes, geopolitical enclosure would be a non-factor. Conversely, if the U.S. was an authoritarian state, its strategy and policy would drive it back to some version of the Monroe Doctrine, so it would be more insular, and some other juxtaposition of continents on the Mercator map would be needed. As it is, the fact that the world's oceans are all connected privileges the nation that can achieve command of the sea. Next slide, please. Now for the bad news. The edge view of the world is dependent on the ability of the U.S. to defend the system. Moreover, nothing of geopolitical significance must be happening between New York and L.A. Unfortunately, neither of these factors seem to me to be holding. There's not time here to go into the matter, but suffice it to say that the difficulties the U.S. Navy has suffered in the past few years are an indicator to me that something is amiss at the policy level, and that, in my view, is related to the inability of the U.S. to adequately fund a comprehensive global defense of the system. Moreover, and I'm not taking political sides here, if the upcoming election is contested and the U.S. suffers even more profound political fracturing, it would be inappropriate to split the Mercator chart along the Mississippi River. New depictions of the world would be needed, and neither of the alternatives shown here are very appetizing to me. What does it all mean? Next slide, please. So what does it all mean? Here are my takeaways from the preceding map-based analysis. They're simple and easy to understand, but difficult to achieve. Hard decisions will be necessary to achieve them, but collectively they offer a clear template for U.S. policy. The overarching goal is to keep the edge view of the world valid. While the U.S. constructed a number of multinational and bilateral security treaties after World War II, many have been dissolved or internal strains have diluted their vitality. The current administration's policy of America First would also seem to move the U.S. from the enclosure map to the Monroe Doctrine map. Major U.S. effort to repair existing alliances and create new ones would seem to be in order. I do not think, barring some security catastrophe, that increased defense budgets are in the cards. So national security strategy must be adapted to constrained means. I'll not further expand on this, but it's worth recalling the Monroe Doctrine map. As I said, the U.S. Unified Command Plan is based on the logic of that depiction, and the approach is region by region. In other words, the U.S. strategy is formed around a series of regional combatant commanders that are virtual proconsuls. By so fragmenting its approach, the U.S. requires far more defense resources than it would if its security and defense strategy was truly globalized. However, that would require a fundamental reorganization of the Unified Command Plan. If anyone is interested in getting more information on my views on how the security strategy should be adjusted, you should contact Chris Tucker, who can put you in direct contact with me. Next slide, please. Plate tectonics require millions of years to produce significant changes in the relationships of continents. Geopolitical tectonics act much faster. However, both are complex processes that are hard to understand, much less predict. However, the focus of this conference is on the future of the world ocean, so some extrapolation of geopolitical analysis I have presented is in order. Rather than an outright prediction, I'll offer possibilities. It's one thing to consider the physical future of the ocean, the effects of pollution and global warming, etc., but quite another to think about how the ocean will figure in future human political affairs. As I previously mentioned, there are some trends that threaten to throw the U.S. back into the Monroe Doctrine view of the world, and others that might bring about Mackinder's nightmare. In both cases, it means that the authoritarian continental powers broke enclosure. On the other hand, optimistically, if the policy vectors of the previous slide are followed, then perhaps we could maintain the edge view, and this would be a new schematic of the world. Although not the same as the all-encompassing system schematic I showed earlier, it's still congruent with the edge view, and that would be a good thing for the future of the United States and frankly for the rest of the world. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.